In the previous video, we looked at two general arguments in favor of skepticism. So first, the idea that skeptical scenarios and good scenarios are indistinguishable. You just can't tell whether you are a brain in a vat or whether you are here in the real world. And then the second type of argument was an argument that shows or attempts to show that if you don't know that you're not in a skeptical scenario, that's going to mean that there's almost nothing that you know, right? Because for instance, supposedly if I know that I'm wearing a really cool sweater, then I also know that I'm not a brain in a vat. But I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat because of this indistinguishability argument. And so I don't know that I'm wearing a very cool sweater. I don't know that I have two hands. I don't know that there's a sun outside, and basically I don't know anything. What I'm going to do in this video is I want to talk about 6 general strategies for dealing with skepticism. And we're going to delve into each of them only to a small extent. I'm going to explain what they are. I'm going to say a little bit about maybe some strengths and weaknesses that they have. But this is more to give you an overview of the terrain, an overview of the different ways that epistemologists are trying to respond to skepticism so that you get an idea of what's going on in these discussions. Alright, and I'm going to talk about 6 strategies. The first is a Moorean strategy based on the ideas of G.E. Moore, who told us that, he knows that he has 2 hands and therefore he knows that there is an external world. Because, hey, hands are things in the external world, right? So we'll talk about that more in a moment. The second strategy is the denial of the closure condition of knowledge using something like a sensitivity condition. The third strategy is contextualism. And the fourth strategy is another kind of contextualism, which I'll call Wittgensteinian contextualism, which is going to be subtly different. Or maybe importantly different. The fifth strategy is like externalism. There's a general thing that externalists in epistemology can do to get rid of skepticism. And finally, I'm going to raise some Kantian doubts. So I'll be basing myself on some ideas from Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason. Okay, let's start at the beginning with the Moorean strategy. So here's what Moore does when he talks about skepticism. So he takes this argument that the skeptic has been using, right? And the skeptic has said, look, if you know that you have hands, then you know that you're not a brain in a vat. But you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, so you don't know that you have 2 hands, right? And so the fact that I don't know that I'm a brain in a vat means that I also don't know that I have 2 hands, that I don't know that I have a computer screen in front of me, and so on, right? Everything is going to go down. Here's what Moore does. He says, okay, I agree with you about the first premise. If I know that I have 2 hands, then I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. I know that I have 2 hands. Therefore, I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. QED, skepticism defeated. So what Moore has done is he has taken this first premise, agreed with it, but where the skeptic then says, oh look, but you don't know that you're a brain in a vat, so you also don't know that you have hands, Moore says, well, I know that I have hands, so I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. And Moore tells us that maybe his argument is better than the skeptic's argument, because it's just more believable that I know that I have 2 hands than it is believable that I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. And there seems to be something to that, right? Moore suggests that, this everyday knowledge which we think we have, there's no reason to doubt it. I mean, there's more reason to doubt that we really understand these skeptical scenarios very well. And so we should accept that given that we have all this everyday knowledge, skepticism must be wrong. I think it's an intriguing argument. I think it's definitely not a terrible argument. But many philosophers have thought that it's a little bit too quick, that it doesn't really do justice to skepticism maybe, that you just assume that you have knowledge and then say, so skepticism must be wrong. Okay, so it has its defenders. I think it's intriguing to explore, but most philosophers have tried to say something a little bit more substantial. Well, here's the second strategy. The second strategy is to deny the closure condition on knowledge. So to remind you of what that was, the idea of the closure condition of knowledge is that if I know something, and if I know that from that something some other things follow, then I know those other things as well. If I know P, and if I know that P implies Q, then I know Q, right? If I know that, at least 4 people went into the park, and I know that if at least 4 people went into the park, then at least 3 people went into the park, then I also know that at least 3 people went into the park. Well, that sounds, it's just using some logical reasoning. And if I know that this logical reasoning is correct, it seems that I should go from knowledge to knowledge. So the closure principle is fairly plausible, and the skeptic uses it, right? Uses it to get this premise that if I know that I'm wearing a really cool sweater, then I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. Because if I have a really cool sweater, I can't be a brain in a vat, right? There's an implication from wearing a really cool sweater to not being a brain in a vat. And so if I know that I'm wearing a really cool sweater and I accept the closure principle, then I also know that I'm not a brain in a vat. And that turns out to be what the skeptic needs to propose their skeptical argument. So one way to defeat the skeptic is to deny closure. It is to say that I can know that I'm wearing a really cool sweater while at the same time not knowing that I'm not a brain in a vat. And one way to argue for that, which is fairly popular, is to bring in a so-called sensitivity condition on knowledge. And the idea of a sensitivity condition would be this. It's to say that one of the things that needs to be the case before you have knowledge is that your knowledge is sensitive, or your belief, I should say, your belief is sensitive to the truth or falsity of what you believe. And in particular, your belief should be such that if what you believe had been false, then you also wouldn't have believed it. So, for instance, let's take my cool sweater. Do I know that I'm wearing a really cool sweater? Well, I believe it and it's true and so on. Here's what the sensitivity condition says. The sensitivity condition says that I only know this if, had I not worn a really cool sweater, I wouldn't have believed it. Right? So if I had not worn a really cool sweater, then I also wouldn't have believed that I had been wearing a really cool sweater. So suppose that I had put on like a corporate shirt with a big Nike logo. That's not cool, right? So I put that on. Well, if I had still believed that I was wearing a cool sweater, then there's something wrong with my ideas of coolness, maybe. But if I had realized, well, this isn't cool, and I had stopped believing that, or I had never believed that in those circumstances, then my belief is sensitive. And so a sensitive belief is one such that if what I believe had been false, then I also wouldn't have had the belief. And now, here is why sensitivity is interesting for a defeat of the skeptic. If sensitivity is a condition on knowledge, then it becomes plausible to say that yes, I can know that I'm wearing a really cool sweater, because if I had worn some bad corporate sweater, I would have realized that and not believed it. But at the same time, I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. Because if I had been a brain in a vat, I still would have believed that I'm not a brain in a vat. Right? That's how this brain in the vat is stimulated by the neuroscientist. Even brains in vats believe that they are real people in the real world. So my belief about my sweater is sensitive, and my belief about not being a brain in a vat is not sensitive. And so that's why it's true to say that I know the first thing and that I do not know the second thing. And so closure doesn't hold. And if closure doesn't hold, then the skeptical argument number 2 just doesn't go through. So that's an intriguing thought, right? That might actually work as an argument against closure. But philosophers have also been relatively skeptical, relatively negative or critical about this approach. Because one thing is that, closure seems to make some sense. right? If I know something and if I see that you can draw certain conclusions from it, why wouldn't I be allowed to draw those conclusions and then come to know them as well? I mean, there's something very intuitive about closure. Maybe more intuitive than about sensitivity, right? So now we have to weigh these two things against each other. And what's maybe even more troublesome, or what is a way to see why closure seems so intuitive, if you deny it, if you accept something like sensitivity, well, that means that you have to condone claims like these. I know I'm wearing a really cool sweater, but I don't know whether I have a body. Right? I don't know whether I have a body, because if I hadn't had a body, I would be the brain in a vat, but I would still believe that I have a body, so my belief about that is insensitive. But it's really weird, right, to say, I know I'm wearing a really cool sweater, but I don't know whether I have a body. I mean, that's weird. So, okay, maybe this is a good strategy, but it comes with some costs and problems. Strategy number 3, contextualism. The contextualist basically says that the skeptic is right, but that the skeptic is only right in a particular context. And the idea of contextualism is this. In different contexts, the standards for knowledge are different. They can be lower or they can be higher. In everyday contexts, the standard for knowledge is relatively low. Right? I look at my shirt, I see that it's really cool. I know it, right? I know that it's cool. I look at my hands, I see that I have 2 of them. I know it. I know that I have 2 hands. But there are other contexts, the contextualist tells us, where the standards for knowledge are higher. And one of the ways to make the standards of knowledge higher is to bring in skeptical hypotheses. Right? If I'm talking about my hands and somebody says, yeah, but do you really know that you have hands? Right? It might all be an illusion. Right? At that moment, the standards of knowledge are raised, and now I no longer know whether I have 2 hands. Right? Because with the low standards of knowledge, yeah, I was succeeding in knowing that I had 2 hands. With the high standards of knowledge, well, I can't reach that high, and so I don't know that I have 2 hands. And so the contextualist tells us that the skeptic is right, and the opponent of skepticism is also right. The skeptic is right, I do not know whether I have 2 hands, but the skeptic is only right in contexts where we are discussing skepticism, maybe. On the other hand, the anti-skeptic is also right that I do know that I have 2 hands, but I only know this in normal everyday contexts and not in the context of discussing skepticism. So this too is a strategy that might work, right? That's interesting to investigate. One of the questions you could have about it is whether it is not just a full capitulation to the skeptic. I mean, what does it mean to say that when the standards of knowledge are low, I know that I have 2 hands, but when they are high, I don't know it? I mean, it's suspiciously close to saying that I don't really know it, right? It's only when I'm not thinking too hard or when I'm not like really paying attention. Okay, then I know it. But of course, once we really bring in the standards of knowledge, then I don't know it. Now, that's not what the contextualist says, right? The contextualist thinks that in both cases we can really speak of knowledge, but it might be hard to escape the feeling that, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we are just claiming that as long as we're not too critical, then we can say that we know things. And of course, the skeptic might just agree with that, right? Yeah, if you're not too critical, you can call anything knowledge. But once you get, you really start looking, okay, then all those knowledge claims turn out to be overblown. So the contextualist will have to do some work to convince us that their answer is not just skepticism. But again, it's an interesting route to take. So here's another kind of contextualism, and it's a bit different. And it finds its source, its origin in Wittgenstein's later works, in the philosophical investigations, in uncertainty. And what Wittgenstein is doing there is he's telling us that, language always happens in a context that Wittgenstein is usually calls a language game in these later texts. And so a language game is a way of using language, but also of connecting it to practices, right? And these can be like verbal practices in language, but they can also be very practical practices, like how we do certain things. Now, when we say something, what we have to do is we have to wonder, well, what kind of move is it? in what kind of language game? Okay. Now, usually Wittgenstein is going to say it's pretty clear what the language game is, in which we talk about knowing and doubting and wondering whether we know something, and so on and so forth. Right? I wonder whether I or whether somebody else really knows something when I have some reason to believe that they're wrong. Right? I might have a reason to believe that they're wrong because I think that what they claim is very unlikely. I might have a reason to believe that somebody is wrong because I think that maybe they didn't really do their best in trying to find out the answer. So to give an example of each, maybe I tell you that there's an elephant in my corridor, and you think, well, that's pretty unlikely, and so you say, hey, Victor, are you sure? Do you really know that? Or maybe you say, hey, Victor, how many books do you own? Right? And I turn around and I say, oh yeah, I own 726 books. They're like, there's no way you could count it that fast, right? I mean, do you really know this, right? I mean, are you sure? Do you know this? So that's why you're making this move, right? Because there's a very concrete doubt. And it is also clear how I can respond to it, right? I can respond to it by giving you my reasons. I can say, yeah, the elephant, I put it there myself. Here, let me show you. And I take the webcam and I point it towards the elephant and you see it. That's a way to respond. Or I can say, oh yeah, I didn't count them, but I have a list of all my books. I don't have a list of all my books, but for the sake of argument, I have a list of all my books and it's 726 or whatever it was I just said. And that would be a way to respond to you, right? These are very concrete responses. And if you're not convinced, then maybe we can do a little bit more investigation, right? We can check things. And that's the language game, right? It's the language game of investigation. It's the language game of trying to find things out and working together in trying to find things out. And so I might wonder whether I have done my investigation well, and you might wonder whether I have done my investigation well. And there are ways to talk about that and to do things that make us, that improve the quality of our investigation. Okay, what about external world skepticism? Well, here Wittgenstein is going to say it's not part of a language game, right? If you wonder whether I counted the books correctly, I can do something about it. If you wonder whether there's an external world at all, what am I supposed to do, right? There's no investigation possible. The whole point of the skeptical scenario is that investigation is impossible. And so what we've done, according to Wittgenstein, if we've taken these terms, like knowledge, and we've taken them out of a perfectly sensible context, or I should say out of a context where they play a role, where they are sensible moves, we take it out, and we act as if it still means the same thing, right? We act as if wondering whether I know that there's an external world is just exactly like wondering whether I know that I own 726 books. And Wittgenstein says, no, you can't just take a term out of a usage context like that and believe that it still functions. It doesn't still function, right? Outside of the context of investigation, doubt, knowledge, like all these things, they mean nothing. They do nothing. They're not moves in a language game. And so something like this radical skeptical doubt, it's empty, right? You're not doing anything in coming up with this radical skeptical doubt. There's no way to respond to it. It's not worth taking seriously. And so where the original contextualist of strategy 3 had these different contexts with different standards of evidence, Wittgenstein has here a context where talking about knowledge makes sense, and another context where talking about knowledge doesn't seem to make sense, at least according to Wittgenstein. And of course, if we are to be convinced by Wittgenstein, we will have to be convinced by his story about language games. We will have to be convinced that linguistic terms are extremely sensitive to context, that you can't take them out and apply them in different circumstances while keeping their meaning. We'll have to be convinced that philosophy isn't itself a good context for terms like knowledge to have a meaning. And so on. So there are questions to be asked. It's not immediately clear that Wittgenstein's response is the correct one, but it's definitely an interesting one to explore. Okay, and that brings me to strategy 5, which is like a general sort of externalist strategy. So as we saw, the skeptic starts from this idea of indistinguishability. Right? On the one hand, there's the skeptical scenario. On the other hand, there's the real good world scenario. And from the inside, we can't tell the difference. Well, the externalist might say, I don't really care about the inside. I'm not an internalist, I'm an externalist. I have a story about knowledge which looks at knowledge from the outside. So maybe I'm a reliabilist. Right? Maybe what I believe is that knowledge is this. It is true belief gained by a reliable method. Okay, let's look at the brain in a vat. Right? The brain in a vat gets all these beliefs by this electronic stimulation, and it's not a reliable method. Right? All their beliefs are false. Well, at least all their sensory beliefs are false. So terrible, no knowledge. Okay. Now I look at the person in the real world, and they get their beliefs through sense perception. Well, that's a very reliable method. And so this person has knowledge, right? When this person sees their hands, they're using a reliable method. What they believe is true. They have knowledge. They know that they have two hands. And that, that makes some sense. If you are an externalist, then it seems that you can really just claim that you don't care about the skeptic's indistinguishability, and that people have knowledge according to your criterion of knowledge. That's nice. And according to some people, this is an argument in favor of externalism. According to other people, it's an argument against externalism, because clearly, if it's so easy to defeat the skeptic, you're not really talking about knowledge. Well, that's an intriguing thought, right? I mean, is externalism really good against skepticism, and that's good for the externalist? Or is externalism suspiciously good against skepticism, right? So that if skepticism is a real worry, and externalism can't do justice to skepticism, then there's something wrong with externalism. Maybe the externalist is not really talking about knowledge. Well, even if we think that externalism about knowledge is good, we might still think that there's something lacking in the externalist response to skepticism. Because the externalist gives us, well, they give us some solace, but it's not maybe the solace that we wanted. Right? What the externalist is telling us is that if we live in the real world, then we know that we live in the real world. Okay. Or if we live in the real world, then our beliefs about physical objects are knowledge. That's what they're telling us. If we live in the real world, then our beliefs about physical objects are knowledge. But I mean, we'd really rather be told that our beliefs about external objects are knowledge. Right? I mean, we don't just want to know that if we are in the good position, then we are in the good position and we can have real knowledge. I mean, we'd love to know that we are in the good position. Or if that's too much to ask, at the very least, we would like to have to be told that we are justified in believing that we are in the good position. I mean, that seems to be sort of for our own peace of mind, maybe, sort of the minimum. I mean, I'd like to be told by my philosophical theory that I am justified in believing that I'm not a brain in a vat. And if the externalist just doesn't talk about justified believing at all because it's too internal, then they're never going to be able to tell me that, right? Well, the externalist could just say that I should stop worrying about that kind of stuff, about being justified in believing things, but it's maybe a little bit of a cop-out, right? I mean, we have to wonder whether that's a price we're willing to pay. Okay, so that was the 5th strategy. Here's my 6th strategy. The 6th strategy is what I'm going to call a Kantian strategy. And one way to think about it is to think about it as, well, maybe going where the externalist goes external, maybe the Kantian goes internal. Let me try to explain that. There is something weird about Cartesian skepticism that Kant notices. He doesn't talk about this so explicitly in the Critique of Pure Reason, but all the ingredients for this story are there in the book. What is weird about Cartesian skepticism, so the way that Descartes sets this up, is that when we have a sensory idea, there are two things that are supposed to be obvious about it. The first thing that is supposed to be obvious about it is that it seems to be of an external object, right? So I have this sensory impression of a tree. It seems to be about a tree in the external world. The second thing that is supposed to be obvious about this idea is that it is a merely internal event, right? It's just something in my consciousness, and it doesn't have any intrinsic connection to external things. And what we might now wonder is, how is this possible, right? How could one and the same mental event, like this conscious impression, how could it be such that it's clearly, right, obviously just something in my mind, right, which doesn't tell me anything about whether there even is an external world, and it is something that seems to be about an external world, right? What is that seeming to be about an external world? Where is it coming from? Right? How can it be there if at the same time what I have is a merely internal episode? Right? And what this raises is a worry about whether Cartesian skepticism even makes sense. Whether it even makes sense to believe that we seem to be aware of an external world, but at the same time it could just as well be the case that it doesn't exist. I mean, those two ideas seem to not fit very easily together. Okay. Here's what the Kantian might go on to say. Let's think about this question of a real world, right? What does it mean to claim that something is real or to claim that something is not real? Well, let's take an everyday example, right? Suppose, well, it's not really everyday, but it's clear enough. We are walking through the desert. I'm not doing that every day. We're walking through the desert, and in the distance we see an oasis. And I say to the person I'm there with, I say, oh, look, an oasis, let's go there. And they say, no, that oasis isn't real, it's an illusion. What does that mean? What does it mean to say that it's not real, that it's an illusion? Well, what it would seem to mean is that it doesn't have the normal kind of causal relations to everything else in the world. Right? It doesn't have the normal kinds of causal relations to me. If I go there, I'm not going to be at the water and the trees. I won't be able to drink anything or sit in the shade. It also doesn't have the right causal relations to its surroundings, right? It's not making the sand over there wet, for instance. So, for something to be unreal is for something to not stand in the right kinds of relations to other things that are real, including myself, but also including other objects in the world. And that's what we mean when we say that something is not real or that it's an illusion. It's that it doesn't have the right kinds of connections. Okay, so what does it mean to say that maybe the entire world isn't real? Well, if reality is what we just said it was, right? Something is real if it has the right kind of place in a causal network of other things, then the claim that maybe the world as a whole isn't real just doesn't make any sense. Right? I mean, you're not saying anything when you're saying that. And so the way that Kant might think about this, or that a Kantian might think about this, is to think of reality as something that, it's a standard that is, in a sense, internal to our own perspective. Right? Something is real in case it has the right kind of integration with the other things that we experience. And something is unreal when it doesn't have the right kind of integration with the things we experience. That's a standard that is internal to our perspective. It doesn't mean that if I think it's real, or that if I think it's not real. It's not sort of subjective in that sense, but it's internal to my experience of the world. Like the standard of reality is integration in the whole of experience. And so there is just no way to think of the world as being maybe unreal and not existing. I mean, that is just not even a thought that makes any sense. There's no thought there. Okay, so that's how it looks from the inside. Now, what about when we look from the outside, right? And that's the standard skeptical scenario as people talk about it nowadays, is okay, let's take the brain in a vat, right? Surely the brain in a vat is wrong, right? The brain in a vat believes that it has a body, that it is walking in a park, but it's really just a brain in a vat. Well, then we are applying an external standard of reality, right? We are applying our standard of reality to the beliefs of the brain. Maybe if we take the internal perspective of the brain, its beliefs are true, right? And from our perspective, maybe what we should say is that its belief, I mean, if we really want to take an external perspective on the brain, maybe what we should say is that its beliefs are true, but they're true about the reality that it encounters, right? Which is this virtual reality and not this reality of objects. And so, like, I don't know whether Kant would really want to even consider the possibility of taking this external, outside perspective that we have towards the brain. It's certainly a perspective that some philosophers in the 20th century have been willing to take, like developing this kind of Kantian thought, in order to suggest that, whatever this brain in the vat is thinking about, it's got to be like its virtual reality. And so everything that it thinks, or most of the things that it thinks, are just true. Right? And so its beliefs are true. It's not wrong. Its beliefs are true. It is right when it thinks that it has a body. Right? Because it has a body from its own internal perspective, which is like the only standard of reality that its thoughts have to answer to. Right? And what we mean then when we say that it's right that it has a body means that it experiences a body that connects in all the right kinds of ways with all the other things that it experiences. And like some philosophers whose thought have been going in that direction would be Hilary Putnam and Donald Davidson. And so there is this sort of general Kantian strategy, which I think has the upshot that, we can't really cogently doubt that the world is unreal. And maybe, which we can use to say that even a brain in a vat, if that's a situation we want to take seriously, is right. From the only standard that its thought is answerable to, which is its own internal standard. Alright, so those are 6 strategies against skepticism. They're very different. They have very different upshots. Some say that skepticism is wrong. Some say that skepticism is actually kind of right, like contextualism. Some say that skepticism doesn't even really make sense, like the Wittgensteinian and maybe to some extent the Kantian option. So there's a lot to think about when we think about skepticism, about how to respond to it especially. And some of the most interesting ideas in epistemology are actually opened up and come into view when we try to do this thinking. So, the debate about skepticism is not about some weird person who doesn't believe that the world exists, and now you have to waste your time talking to them. It's about testing our own epistemological theories and see how they can respond to even these, fairly radical scenarios.